All right. So the first thing we need to realize is that when we look at, all right, secant equals what? Secant of x equals what? If I'm looking at my other trig functions, what is secant? Secant is 1 over cosine x. So when we're looking at secant, we need to realize that we are going to be using the cosine curve. And if I go pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And everybody, when you are doing two of these, I expect you to label all of your important points. So, and I'm going to say there's 1 and negative 1. So the cosine of 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of pi is negative 1. 3 pi over 2 is 0. 2 pi is 1. And those are things you should have memorized. All right? And then we're going to come and we're going to reflect this. So this, let's see, will that be, yeah, we'll make it enough. All right, so the blue curve is our cosine curve. Since we are dealing with the opposite of this, since we're dealing with the reciprocal, anytime we hit 0, what's 1 over 0? No, 1 over 0 is what? Undefined. So that means we're going to have what we call an asymptote. So anytime we have a 0 for secant, we're going to have an asymptote. So we need to draw our asymptotes where they belong. All right, so we have our cosine curve, our secant curve, because secant can be anything except between 1 and negative 1. So our secant curve is going to look like this. All right, so that's what our secant curve is going to look like. So this is the general form of the secant curve. So we can come in and we can now get rid of our cosine curve. And that's what the cosecant looks like. We use our cosine curve to determine our asymptotes and determine where we start at. So that's the general form of the secant curve. So let's now look at the general form, the y equals, for the cosecant curve. Cosecant is what? It's the reciprocal of what? It's the reciprocal of sine. So that means that I'm going to have sine. I'm going to have my sine curve. So I'm going to label my important points. And then I'm going to reflect those important points across the zero. And remember, whenever you have to graph, if you have to have two periods graphed, you have to show me your important points. Don't leave me guessing, because I'm probably not going to. So what we're going to do first is we're going to do the cosine curve. So we know that the cosine of, or the sine of 0, we're doing the sine curve. So we know the sine of 0 is 0. And we know that the sine of pi over 2 is 1. The sine of pi is 0. And the sine of 3 pi over 2 is negative 1. Sine of 2 pi is 0. So I'm going to plot my points on the negative side. So now I've got this curve. That's my sine curve. And again, where we have y, or where we have our y equals 0, those are going to be our asymptotes. So we're going to draw our asymptotes in. From Algebra 2, do you remember what an asymptote is? An asymptote is a place where you cannot have an answer to a solution, or to a problem. So then I'm going to draw and again, I'm not looking for perfection. So, and what I can do now is I can get rid of my sine curve. And that's what the cosecant looks like. So we have two distinct curves. We have the secant x and the cosecant x, and they are the reciprocal of sine and cosine. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine, and cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So we are going to do an example problem. So we're going to look at the general form of y equals a cosecant of bx. So if my equation is 2 cosecant of 1/2 x, the first thing I need to do with this problem is I need to find out what my period's going to be. So I'm going to say that 0 is less than or equal to 1/2 x is less than or equal to 2 pi. So I'm going to multiply everything by 2. 2 times 0 is 0. Less than or equal to 2 times 1/2 is 1, so it's x. And 2 times 2, less than or equal, 2 times 2 pi is 4 pi. So, and then, so I know what my period is. My period is 0 to 4 pi. And my amplitude is 2. So, I'm going to graph that. So, when I make my chart, I'm going to have 0, and I'm going to have 4 pi. What's halfway between 0 and 4 pi? 2 pi. What's halfway between 0 and 2 pi? Pi. And halfway between 2 pi and 4 pi is 3 pi. So my important points I'm going to label pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. And I'm going to label on the negative side also. All right, so I'm going to have 1/2 x, so 1/2 of pi is pi over 2. 1/2 of 2 pi is pi. 1/2 of 3 pi is 3 pi over 2. 1/2 of 4 pi is 2 pi. So now I'm going to do, and I'm going to change this because I know that this is that cosecant equals 1 over sine. So I'm going to say that the sine of 1/2 x, so the sine of 0 is 0, sine of pi over 2 is 1, sine of pi is 0, sine of 3 pi over 2 is negative 1, sine of 2 pi is 0. And now I have 2 sine 1/2 x. 2 times 0 is 0, 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 0 is 0, 2 times negative 1 is negative 2, 2 times 0 is 0. So that means that I'm going to have 2 and negative 2. And I'm using sine, so very lightly, I'm going to sketch my sine curve. And then I'm going to draw my asymptotes. And your asymptotes are where your curve hits y equals 0. And asymptotes are drawn with dashed lines. So the cosecant is going to be these guys. And again, when you're done, you can get rid of your sine curve, because your sine curve has done its job. So there's what we have. And this was our first example. And now we're going to move on to example 2. In example 2, we're going to look at y equals a secant of x minus d. And our example is going to be 3/2. Y equals a secant, or y equals 3/2 times the secant of x minus pi over 2. So the first thing I have to do is I have to find out what my period is. So I have 0 is less than or equal to x minus pi over 2 is less than or equal to 2 pi. And I'm going to add pi over 2 to everything. And I get pi over 2 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 5 pi over 2. So now I'm going to create my table. And I'm going to say that I have pi over 2 and I have 5 pi over 2. So what's halfway between pi over 2 and 5 pi over 2? It's going to be 3 pi over 2. What's halfway between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2? That's going to be 3 pi over 4. And halfway between pi, or 3 pi over 2 and 5 pi over 2 is going to be so that's 8 pi over 2 divided by 2 is this is going to be pi, and this is going to be 2 pi. There we go. I knew I'd made a mistake. So halfway between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2 is pi. Halfway between 3 pi over 2 and 5 pi over 2 is 2 pi. So I'm going to say x minus pi over 2. Pi over 2 minus pi over 2 is 0. Pi minus pi over 2 is pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 minus pi over 2 is pi. 2 pi minus pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. And 5 pi over 2 minus pi over 2 is 2 pi. So secant of x is 1 over cosine x. So I'm going to use cosine. So I'm going to say the cosine of x minus pi over 2. Cosine of 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of pi is -1. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. And the cosine of 2 pi is 1. So I'm going to do 3/2 times the cosine of x minus pi over 2. So what 3/2 times 1 is 3/2. 3/2 times 0 is 0. 3/2 times -1 is -3/2. 3/2 times 0 is 0. 3/2 times 1 is 1. So now I'm ready to make my graph. I'm going to label my important points, and I'm going to have pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, 5 pi over 2, 0, negative pi over 2, negative 3 pi over 2, and negative 2 pi. So I'm going to have 1, 2, -1, -2. So 3/2 is going to start there. So it's going to come down. Oh, I went up one too many. So it's going to come there. Oops. All right. So there's what our curve looks like. That's our cosine curve. Our secant curve, we have to draw our asymptotes. And our asymptotes are wherever we hit y equals 0. And so there's what my curve looks like. I drew my cosine curve, and then from my peaks, my maxes and my mins, I then drew my secant curve.